I want you to picture something. It's 3 a.m., you're asleep. Your door opens. You don't hear footsteps because you're used to the sounds of this house. Every creak, every draft. You've lived here 4 years and your body learned to sleep through all of it. But something wakes you. Not a sound, a feeling. The feeling that someone is standing very close to you in the dark. His name was Derek. He was 23 years old. He was my stepbrother. And when I turned on the lamp on my bedside table, he didn't move. He just stood there, 3 feet from my bed, staring. I was 17. I said his name. He didn't answer. I asked him what he was doing. He still didn't answer, and then he moved toward me. I'm going to pause here for a moment because before I tell you what happened next, I need you to understand something about the 6 months that came before that night. Derek had been living in our house since my mother married his father. I was 13 when they got married. He was 19. He didn't speak to me for the first year, which was fine. I didn't need him to. We passed each other in hallways. We sat at the same dinner table. We watched the same television from opposite ends of the couch. It was awkward. It was uncomfortable. It was the normal ugly texture of 2 families being pressed together and told to act like one. I thought that was all it was. I was wrong. The first time Derek did something I didn't have a word for, I was 14. My mother and his father were out. I was doing homework in the kitchen. He came home from work. Normal enough. He sat down at the table across from me. He watched me work. I asked him if he needed something. He said no. He kept watching. I moved to my room. He followed me down the hallway. Stopped. Outside my door, I could see his shadow in the gap at the bottom. He stood there for maybe 4 minutes, then walked away. I didn't tell anyone, because what would I say? My stepbrother stood outside my door for 4 minutes? That's not a crime. That's barely even a story. So I said nothing, and he learned that silence meant he could keep going. By the time I was 15, the things I wasn't saying had become a list. The time he walked into the bathroom while I was in the shower. He claimed he didn't know I was in there. My mother believed him instantly. The time he borrowed my phone and I found it in his room, texts open. The time I woke up and the chair in my room had been moved. I don't sleepwalk. I never touched that chair. The time he watched me from the backyard, through the kitchen window for 20 minutes while I made lunch. I know how this sounds. I know you're doing the same thing. I was doing. Looking for the explanation. Looking for the way each of these things could be nothing. That's what they trained me to do. My stepfather's name was Gary. He was a large man. Quiet at home, loud in a crowd, the kind of man who laughed too easily and meant it less than you thought. He loved Derek, not just as a father loves a son, more than that. In the way that some parents love a child who has always been fragile, who has needed protecting from the world. Derek had apparently gone through something in his early 20s, some kind of breakdown. Gary had spent 2 years helping him recover. Was told this as context, as explanation, as a reason to be patient. I was patient for 3 years. My mother. Her name is Linda. If I had to describe her in one sentence, it would be this. She was a woman who loved peace more than she loved truth. She didn't lie. Not exactly. She just chose not to see things that would have made her life harder. And I was, by the time I was 16, something that would have made her life very, very hard. Because the things I was starting to say were things she couldn't absorb without consequence, without confronting Gary, without confronting Derek, without potentially losing the life she'd rebuilt after my father left. So instead, she said things like, "You're too sensitive. You misunderstood." He probably didn't mean it like that. You know, Derek has had a hard time. You could be kinder. I think about that word a lot. I had one friend who knew. Her name was Cassie. She lived 3 streets over. We'd been friends since 6th grade. Told her in pieces. Never the whole thing at once. A little at a time, the way you test water temperature before you get in. She never said I was wrong. She said, "That's not normal." Simple as that. That's not normal. 3 words I'd been afraid to hear, because hearing them meant I had to do something about it. The night of my 16th birthday, Derek gave me a card. Inside, he had written, "Happy birthday. You're growing up." That was all. I showed it to my mother. She said it was sweet. I didn't sleep that night. By the time I was 17, I had documented 41 incidents. I know that sounds formal. It sounds like something a lawyer does. But I'd started writing things down because Cassie told me to. "Just write it down," she said. "Date, time, what happened. Even if it's small, especially if it's small." So I did. In a notebook I kept between my mattress and the box spring. 41 incidents. Some of them were small. Things that individually sounded like nothing. Some of them were not small at all. I was waiting. I don't know what I was waiting for. Maybe for one of them to be big enough that someone would finally believe me. I didn't know that the 42nd incident would come at 3 a.m. And I didn't know that when I tried to tell my parents what happened. The thing that would hurt me most wasn't what Derek did. It was what they chose to do after. Back to that night. He moved toward me. I got out of the other side of the bed. I said his name again, louder. He kept coming. I picked up the lamp from my nightstand. It was the only thing in reach. He stopped. We stood there looking at each other across the bed. His face was something I can't fully describe. Not angry. Not excited. Blank. Distant. Like whatever was happening inside him had nothing to do with me as a person. That was the part that stayed with me longest. I wasn't real to him. I was just there. I said, "Get out of my room." He looked at me for a moment. More, then he left. I locked my door. I sat on the floor against it, and I stayed there until my alarm went off at 6. At breakfast, I told my mother. I told her everything. From the beginning. Not calmly. I had been up for 3 hours rehearsing calm, and it didn't work. I cried. I talked too fast. I repeated myself. She listened, or she appeared to listen. When I finished, she said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "He was probably sleepwalking." I stared at her. She said, "Gary says he's done it before." I said, "He was awake. He looked at me. He walked toward me when I spoke." She said, "You were probably scared and misread the situation." I said, "I didn't misread it." She said, "Honey, you know how much stress Derek has been under." That was it. That was the whole conversation. She poured herself a second cup of coffee. She asked if I wanted toast. I called Cassie from the school bathroom that morning. She said, "You need to go to a counselor or a teacher, someone who has to report it." I said, "Nothing happened. Not technically." He came into my room and I scared him off. She said, "That's not the point." She was right, but I went home that afternoon, and I still didn't go to a teacher, not yet. Gary came home from work that evening. Apparently my mother had told him, in her version, which I can only guess at. He sat down across from me in the living room. He said, "I want you to understand something about Derek." He talked for 8 minutes. I counted. He talked about Derek's mental health history, his sensitivities, how hard the last few years had been, how much Derek had improved, how important it was that the family support him. He never once asked me, "What happened?" Not once. At the end of 8 minutes, he said, "I'm going to ask you not to repeat this story to anyone outside this house." He said it quietly, like it was a favor he was doing me. I said, "What story?" He said, "I think you know what I mean." I looked at him. I said, "I haven't told anyone." He said, "Good." He stood up. He said, "Derek has an early morning tomorrow. He needs his sleep," and he walked out of the room. I want to pause here and tell you something. There is a specific kind of silence that happens in a house when something has been decided that no one will say out loud. It fills the rooms. It sits at the dinner table. It rides in the car. It's not tense. It's too controlled for tension. It's just heavy. That silence moved into our house the next morning, and it never left. 3 weeks after the night in my room, Derek's behavior changed. Or maybe it didn't change. Maybe I was just paying different attention. He started watching me more openly, not even hiding it. Like he knew he was safe. Like the conversation with Gary had been a message to him too. The message, nothing is going to happen. I moved through, my days feeling like I was made of glass. At school I was fine. At school I was normal. I laughed with Cassie. I turned in papers. I tried out for the spring play and got a small part. At home, I ate dinner and went to my room and put the chair under my door handle and stayed there until morning. This went on for 6 weeks. Then one Thursday night in March, I came home from rehearsal late, my key stuck in the front door like it sometimes did. I was wrestling with it in the dark. Derek opened it from the inside. He'd been standing just behind it. I don't know how long he'd been standing there. He looked at me for a moment, then he stepped aside and let me in. I went straight to my room, sat on my bed. I took out the notebook. I wrote down what had just happened. Then I turned to the back of the notebook where I had a different list. People I could tell. I had 4 names. Cassie's name. My school counselor, Mrs. Rowan. My aunt on my father's side, Diana. And a teacher named Mr. Peterson who had asked me twice in the last month if I was okay. I looked at those 4 names for a long time. I picked up my phone. I want to tell you who I called. But first I need to tell you what happened the next morning. Because what happened the next morning is the reason that this story ends the way it does. And it's the reason I'm still here to tell it. I woke up at 6 as usual. I was going to tell someone that day. I'd decided, I got up, I showered. I got dressed. I went to the kitchen to make coffee. Derek was already there. He was sitting at the kitchen table. In front of him was my notebook. Everything in me went cold. I stood in the doorway and I looked at it, my handwriting, my dates, my 42 entries. He looked up at me. He said nothing. He just looked at me. Gary walked in from the hallway. He looked at Derek. He looked at the notebook. He looked at me. He said, "We need to talk." The conversation that followed lasted 2 hours. It took place at the kitchen table. My mother was there. Gary was there. Derek was there. I sat on one side. They sat on the other. They had read the notebook. All of it. Gary said the notebook was concerning, that my perceptions were distorted, that I had been building a false narrative about Derek, that had no basis in reality. My mother said she was worried about me, that maybe I needed to speak to someone. Derek said nothing. He sat with his hands flat on the table and he looked at a point slightly above my head and he said absolutely nothing for 2 hours. Gary said that he was going to ask me again, more formally this time, not to share these stories outside the family. He said if I did, there would be consequences. I asked what kind of consequences. He said, "We'll discuss that if it becomes necessary." My mother reached across the table and took my hand. She said, "We love you. We're just worried. Derek would never hurt you. You know that, right?" I looked at her hand on mine. I thought about all the things I knew. I said, "Sure." Then I asked to be excused. I went to school, and I went straight to Mrs. Rowan's office. Mrs. Rowan was a small woman with short gray hair and reading glasses she wore on a beaded chain. She had a bowl of hard candies on her desk that she offered. To everyone who came in, I didn't take one. I sat down and I said, "I need to report something." She closed her door. She sat down. She said, "Tell me." I talked for 45 minutes. She didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she opened her desk drawer and took out a form. She said, "I'm required by law to report what you've told me." I said, "I know." She said, "Are you ready for what comes next?" Said no, but go ahead. What came next was a phone call to Child Protective Services, which resulted in a visit from 2 workers that afternoon, which resulted in a call to my mother. which resulted in my mother showing up at the school looking like she had aged 5 years in 3 hours. She sat across from me in Mrs. Rowan's office. She said, "Why would you do this?" "Not. Is this true? Not? Are you okay? Why would you do this?" I said, "Because someone was finally asking." She went quiet. Mrs. Rowan said something about mandatory reporting. My mother didn't look at Mrs. Rowan. She looked at me. She said, "Gary is going to be devastated." And that was the moment I understood, completely, finally, without any remaining confusion, where I stood in this family. The next 4 months were something I can only describe as living inside a storm that's also somehow completely silent. Child. Protective Services opened an investigation. Law enforcement got involved. There were interviews. There was a forensic interview, a specific kind, done by a specialist, in a room with a camera, designed so that children don't feel interrogated. Told my story from the beginning. Every incident, every date, every detail from the notebook. The specialist asked quiet questions. She had a way of making the room feel very still. Afterwards, she told me I had done well. I asked what that meant. She said it meant I had been clear and consistent. Meanwhile, at home, which I was still living in because there was nowhere immediately for me to go, the atmosphere became something I don't have perfect words for. Gary didn't speak to me. Derek wasn't there. He had moved to a friend's house at the start of the investigation. I don't know whose choice that was. My mother spoke to me, but carefully, the way you speak to someone you're no longer sure you know. She made dinners. She asked about school. She said normal things in a voice that wasn't quite normal. At night, I could sometimes hear her crying in the bedroom. I sat in my room and I thought, she's crying for them, not for me. And I was right. My Aunt Diana, my father's sister, called me one evening. My mother must have told her something. Diana said, "Tell me what's happening." I told her. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I'm coming to get you." I said, "You can't just..." She said, "I've already talked to someone. You can stay with me during the investigation. Your mother can agree to it voluntarily, or we can make it official, but you're not staying in that house." I sat on my bed and looked at the chair that still lived under my door handle every night. I said, "Okay." I moved into Diana's apartment 2 weeks after the investigation began. My mother packed my bags. She folded everything very carefully. She put a photograph of the two of us, from before the marriage, from when it was just us, into the front pocket of my duffel bag. I found it that night when I was unpacking. I sat on Diana's spare bed and held it for a while. I didn't cry. I had already decided I was done making myself smaller for people who would not do the same for me. I put the photograph in the drawer, closed it. 3 months into the investigation, something happened that none of us had anticipated. Something that changed everything. Not what Derek had done to me, what he had done before. During the investigation, law enforcement conducted a search. I wasn't told much at the time. Diana knew, more than she told me, I think, to protect me from details I didn't need yet. But what they found on Derek's phone and computer, I won't describe in detail. I'll only tell you that it was enough. More than enough. It established a pattern. It established intent. And it meant that what Derek had been doing in our house was not an isolated aberration. He had a history. The district attorney's office became involved. Derek was arrested. He was charged. I will not list the charges. They are a matter of public record, and anyone who wants to can find them. What I will tell you is that when Diana told me, I sat very still for a long time. Then I said, "Did my mother know?" Diana said, "I don't know." I said, "Gary?" She said, "I don't know." I said, "What does I don't know mean?" She said, "It means the investigation is still going." My mother called me every day for 6 weeks after the arrest. I answered the first few. The conversations were the same each time. She said she was scared. She said Gary was in a terrible state. She said Derek had a condition, that this wasn't his. fault, that the system was going to destroy him, that our family was falling apart. She didn't ask how I was doing, not once in those first 6 weeks. On the 7th call, I let it go to voicemail. She left a message. I listened to it. She said, "I know you're angry, but Derek is still your brother. He's still family. And I need you to think about what happens to him if this goes all the way to trial." I listened to that message 4 times. Then I deleted it, and I stopped answering. Diana was careful not to take sides in what she said to me. She was doing her best. But one evening, she sat down across from me and said very simply, "You don't owe anyone your forgiveness on their timeline." I wrote that down. I still have it. My father, I should tell you about him. He had been out of my life since I was 9. His choice. Not a dramatic exit, just a slow absence that eventually became permanent. When the investigation started, he heard about it through his sister, Diana. He called me. It was the first time I had heard his voice in over 4 years. He said he was sorry. About everything. About being absent. About what had happened in that house. I didn't know what to do with. That phone call, I said, "Thank you for calling." He said he would come if I needed him. I said, "I'll let you know." I hung up and sat for a long time in Diana's kitchen. Some things you don't know how to feel until years later. This was one of them. The pretrial process took 8 months. During that time, I turned 18. Diana made me a cake. Cassie came over, and we watched old movies and stayed up too late, and for one night, it almost felt like before. My mother sent a card. Inside, she had written, "I love you." I'm sorry things got so complicated. Complicated. I read that word 3 times. Then I put the card in the drawer with the photograph. When the trial date was set, the prosecutor's office contacted me about testifying. I had expected it. I said yes, immediately. My victim advocate, a woman named Beth who had been assigned to my case, sat with me in a conference room and explained what it would look like. The courtroom, the process, cross-examination. She said, "Defense attorneys are going to try to challenge your credibility." I said, "I know." She said, "Do you have any questions?" I said, "Is the evidence strong enough without my testimony?" She thought about this. She said, "Stronger with it." I said, "Then I'll be there." The night before I testified, I couldn't sleep. Not from fear, from something I couldn't immediately name. Lay in Diana's spare room, which I had come to think of as my room, and I looked at the ceiling and I tried to identify it. It took until 2 in the morning. It was grief, not fear. Grief for the version of my life where none of this happened, where I was 17 in a house with a mother who chose me, where the person I lived with was ordinary and safe, where I slept through the night without a chair under the door. That version of my life didn't exist and had never existed. But I grieved it anyway. At 2 a.m., I got up and went to the kitchen and made tea and sat at Diana's table until the sky started going pale. Then I went and got dressed. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. I had this image from television, the high ceilings, the drama. It was just a room, fluorescent lights, wood-paneled walls, rows of seats. Gary and my mother were sitting behind the defense table. I saw them when I walked in. My mother looked at me. I looked back. Neither of us moved. I sat on the side of the room designated for witnesses, and I kept my eyes forward. Derek was at the defense table. I hadn't seen him in nearly a year. He looked smaller than I remembered, not physically. Physically, he was the same, just smaller. He didn't look at me when I walked in. He looked at his hands. I won't walk you through every moment of the trial. What I will tell you is this. When I took the stand, I was calm. I'm not sure how. I had been awake for most of the night. I had eaten almost nothing that morning, and I was about to speak in front of people, including the woman who had raised me. But I was calm. The prosecutor asked me questions. I answered them. I told the truth. All of it. From the beginning, my voice didn't shake. When defense counsel cross-examined me, I stayed calm. He asked questions designed to suggest I had misinterpreted events, that I had constructed a false narrative. That I was, in essence, a troubled teenager with an agenda. I answered every question directly. I did not get defensive. I did not explain myself beyond what was asked. When he finished, the prosecutor asked a few more questions, then I was excused. Walked back to my seat. Diana was sitting in the gallery. She gave me one small nod. That was enough. The jury deliberated for 2 days. I went back to Diana's apartment. I cooked dinner. I did homework. I called Cassie. On the second afternoon, Beth called. She said, "They have a verdict. I want to tell you what the verdict was, but I want to pause before that for just a moment. Because in the hours before that call, I had been sitting in Diana's kitchen and I had been thinking about something that had nothing to do with the verdict. I had been thinking about all the times I hadn't spoken. The first time Derek stood outside my door and I said nothing. The morning after the 3 a.m. incident when my mother said sleepwalking and I let her, all the dinners where I sat across from Gary and kept my face still, all the calls I almost made and didn't. I had been thinking about what that silence cost, not just me, but what it would have cost if I had kept going. If I had never gone to Mrs. Rowan, if I had sat with that silence until I disappeared into it. Some silences protect you, some silences hollow you out. I had been living in the wrong kind for too long. The courtroom was full when the verdict was read. I sat behind the prosecutor. Beth sat beside me. The jury filed in. The foreperson stood. The judge asked if the jury had reached a verdict. The foreperson said yes. What followed was approximately 45 seconds. 45 seconds that I have replayed in my mind hundreds of times since. The charges were read. The verdicts were read. Guilty, guilty, guilty. 3 counts. On the third one, I heard a sound from behind me. I didn't turn around, but I knew what it was. It was Gary. Derek was remanded into custody. The room shifted. People stood. Papers rustled. I sat still. Beth put her hand briefly on my arm. I looked at the front of the courtroom. The judge was writing something. He had said nothing throughout the reading of the verdicts. He was a man in his 60s with very pale eyes and the kind of face that gave nothing away. He looked up from what he was writing. He looked at the defense table. He said, "I want to note for the record that the conduct detailed in this case represents one of the most egregious failures of parental responsibility I have encountered in over 20 years on the bench." He paused. A young person in this family attempted to report what was happening to her and was actively discouraged from doing so by the adults who were responsible for her protection. Another pause. This court takes that seriously. He looked down. He continued with the procedural business. The room began to empty. I sat for a long moment. Then I stood up. I walked out of the courthouse into afternoon light. It was an ordinary day outside. Traffic. Someone's car radio. A woman walking a dog. Diana was waiting for me on the steps. She didn't say anything. She just put her arms around me, and I stood there in the ordinary afternoon, and I let her. In the weeks that followed, there was a lot to process. Sentencing. Victim. Impact statement. The paperwork of moving forward. Gary and my mother separated that winter. I only know this because Diana told me. My mother called once after the verdict. She didn't leave a message. I didn't call back. Not because I hated her. I want to be clear about that. Not because I hated her, but because I had spent years waiting for her to choose me, and she had used all her chances. Derek received a sentence that the prosecutor's office described as appropriate given the evidence. I won't go into details. What I will tell you is that at the sentencing hearing, I delivered a victim impact statement. I had written it in Diana's kitchen over 3 evenings. I read it in 4 minutes and 20 seconds. When I finished, I folded the papers. I walked back to my seat. Derek was looking at his hands again. My mother was not in the courtroom. I don't want to give you a tidy ending, because it isn't tidy. I'm in college now. I'm studying something I didn't expect to study, but that makes more sense than anything I expected. Cassie is at a school across the country and we text almost every day. Diana and I have dinner twice a week when I'm not buried in work. My father and I are in cautious, careful contact. It's slow. It might not become what either of us hopes, but it's something. My mother and I are not in contact. That may change. It may not. I hold that question without trying to answer it yet. What I think about most isn't the verdict. It isn't the courtroom. It's Mrs. Rowan and the bowl of hard candies on her desk and the way she said, very simply, "Tell me." 2 words. That was all it took. 2 words and someone willing to actually listen. Think about all the people right now who are in houses that feel like the one I grew up in, where the silence is heavy, where someone has been told their perceptions are wrong, where the person who should protect them has made a different choice. Think about them, and I want to say, your notebook matters. Every date, every detail, even the small things, especially the small things. I read every comment I get on these videos. If you've been in a situation like this, if you've been the person sitting at a table being told you imagined it, being told to keep quiet for the sake of someone else, I want to hear from you. Not because I have answers, but because you deserve to be heard. What's one thing you wish someone had said to you when you were in the middle of it? I'm going to read every single one. Every single one.